If you already know what to do but still don't do it, this video is for you. I'm about to ruin your entire worldview on productivity, in a good way. You think success comes from motivation and discipline? Wrong. It comes from friction, energy, and identity timing. Here's the hard truth most people never hear. You are not lazy. You're misaligned. What feels like laziness is usually a nervous system stuck in energy conservation mode, not a lack of ambition or discipline. Your biology is doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect you from perceived energy loss. And this is where ambitious people get trapped. Most ambitious people fail because they keep applying effort solutions to energy problems. They try to push harder, force routines, shame themselves into motion, when the real issue is that their internal architecture is fighting back. Think about how strange that is for a moment. The people who want the most out of life often feel the least capable of starting. Not because they don't care, but because they care so much that their system locks up. This isn't a character flaw. It's not a motivation problem. It's a design problem. When your nervous system senses a gap between demanded effort and available energy, it doesn't negotiate. It shuts the doors and pulls the emergency brake. That shutdown gets mislabeled as laziness. And once that label sticks, people stop looking for better explanations. I get it, because I've been there. The frustration of knowing exactly what you should be doing and feeling unable to do it. The mental exhaustion that comes from constantly telling yourself, tomorrow I'll be different. And the deeper exhaustion that comes from believing something is wrong with you. But what if the problem isn't you at all? What if the problem is that your life is engineered in a way that makes progress expensive, fragile, and dependent on motivation you can't reliably access? That's what this video is about. Not discipline, not hustle. Not turning you into some hyper-optimized productivity machine. By the end of this video, you'll understand how to redesign your life so that progress happens by default, even on your lowest motivation days, without becoming a hyper-disciplined robot. We're not going to fix you. We're going to redesign the system you're operating inside of. Because once the system changes, your behavior follows automatically. The ambition-energy paradox. Ambition doesn't arrive quietly. It shows up as vivid mental images of a better future, sharper standards, and a constant internal pressure that says, I could be more than this. On the surface, that sounds like fuel. But beneath it, something subtler is happening. For highly ambitious people, ambition doesn't just inspire action. It quietly raises expectations. It tells the brain to anticipate outcomes that reality cannot immediately deliver, and that mismatch creates tension long before any real work begins. Here's where the paradox forms. Highly ambitious people often experience chronic inertia because ambition raises the brain's dopamine expectation baseline faster than reality can satisfy it. The brain doesn't respond to effort itself. It responds to the promise of reward. When the imagined outcome is large and the first step feels small, slow, or uncertain, the internal chemistry doesn't line up. Effort starts to feel disproportionately expensive. And when effort doesn't match imagined outcomes, the brain doesn't argue or complain. It shuts down to avoid disappointment. What looks like procrastination is actually a protective response. This is why starting feels harder than continuing. At the beginning, the gap between vision and reality is widest. The mind is already living at the finish line, while the body is being asked to take a step that feels insignificant by comparison. That gap creates dopamine resistance. The system senses low return on investment and throttles output, not because it's weak, but because it's efficient. Your brain is constantly running cost-benefit calculations, and ambition, paradoxically, can distort those calculations enough to stall the entire system. That's where the idea of scale becomes crucial. Shrinking the daily goal to something that feels almost insultingly small changes the math. Open the document instead of write the essay. Stand up instead of go work out. At that scale, the dopamine system no longer detects a threat of wasted effort. Resistance drops. Action becomes chemically permissible again. Momentum doesn't come from motivation here. It comes from lowering the entry cost so much that the system stops objecting. The strange thing is that ambition doesn't disappear when the goal gets smaller. It stays in the background, quietly intact. What changes is the friction between intention and action. When the brain experiences a completed action instead of a postponed ideal, it gets evidence instead of pressure. Evidence stabilizes the system. Pressure destabilizes it. This is why tiny actions often unlock disproportionate momentum for ambitious people, even though they feel almost embarrassingly simple. Think of ambition like installing high-performance software on low battery mode. The system doesn't crash, it throttles performance. The hardware is protecting itself from overload. Once you understand that, the frustration starts to dissolve. The issue was never that you lacked drive. The issue was that your internal system was being asked to perform at a level it didn't yet have the energy architecture to support. And when that architecture changes, everything that felt heavy begins to feel possible again. At some point, motivation became the hero of every productivity story, as if action were a moral achievement and inaction a personal failure. But when you zoom out and observe behavior honestly, a different pattern emerges. Behavior is not driven by motivation, it's driven by friction gradients. The brain is not inspired by what matters most, it is pulled toward what costs the least. Every decision runs through a quiet filter. How much energy will this take right now? This is why productivity collapses in environments that look harmless on the surface. High-value actions often carry invisible friction. They require setup, clarity, emotional exposure, or sustained focus. Low-value distractions, on the other hand, are frictionless. One tap, one swipe, no uncertainty. The brain always chooses the path that requires the least perceived energy, not because it's weak, but because it's conserving resources. Productivity fails when high-value actions have higher friction than low-value distractions. At that point, the outcome is already decided long before conscious intention enters the room. Seen through this lens, environment stops being background noise and starts becoming the main driver. A phone within arm's reach silently competes with every meaningful task. A cluttered workspace adds micro-delays that the nervous system interprets as effort. Even something as small as having to open the right tab or find the correct tool becomes a barrier when energy is already limited. None of this feels dramatic. That's the danger. Friction rarely announces itself. It simply redirects behavior over and over again. What changes everything is the realization that progress doesn't require adding more discipline to this equation. It requires changing the slope. When friction is subtly shifted, when distractions become slightly harder to access, and meaningful actions become slightly easier, the brain follows the new path automatically. No pep talk required, no internal negotiation. Behavior flows in the direction the environment quietly allows. This is why small environmental shifts carry disproportionate power. A phone placed out of reach, a work tool left visible and ready, a future task already opened, already waiting. These adjustments don't rely on willpower, they bypass it. They reduce the activation energy required to begin. The system no longer asks, "Do I feel like this?" It simply continues along the path of least resistance. Your environment, whether intentionally designed or not, is always acting like a slope. If entertainment is downhill and your goals are uphill,
No amount of internal pressure will change gravity.
but when the slope changes, even slightly, movement becomes natural. Effort stops feeling like a personal battle and starts feeling like a structural outcome. And once behavior is aligned with architecture instead of motivation, consistency stops being something you chase and becomes something that quietly emerges.
There's a quiet tension that ambitious people live with every day, and it rarely gets named. It's the feeling of knowing who you want to be while repeatedly behaving like someone you don't recognize. The vision is sharp, the standards are high, but the evidence doesn't seem to match. That gap creates a subtle form of cognitive dissonance, and over time, it erodes trust in yourself. Not confidence in your goals, confidence in you.
Most people assume this tension means something is missing internally. More discipline, more belief, more motivation. But neuroscience points in the opposite direction. Most people wait to feel like the person they want to become before acting. Yet identity doesn't work that way. Identity updates after repeated behavior, not before. The brain looks for proof, not intention. When action is inconsistent, identity lags behind ambition. The result is a strange limbo where desire exists without evidence and self-trust slowly degrades. This is why affirmations often feel hollow to ambitious people. Declaring "I'm disciplined" while repeatedly failing to act creates internal resistance, not confidence. The nervous system notices the mismatch. It registers the claim as unverified. Over time, this creates an internal credibility problem. The mind stops believing its own promises. Ambition remains intact, but it floats above reality, disconnected from lived experience. What actually restores alignment is evidence at the smallest possible scale. A single completed action carries more weight than hours of planning or intention. One follow-through, however minor, begins to shift the internal narrative. Instead of identity being something you declare, it becomes something that is recorded. This is where a proof-based identity quietly forms. Not grand statements about who you are, but simple patterns that demonstrate reliability over time. A rule like "never misses twice" works because it respects how identity is built. It doesn't demand perfection, it demands continuity. One action resets the system.
2 in a row, start to build trust.
The brain responds to this consistency by lowering internal resistance. Self-talk softens. Doubt loosens its grip. Not because motivation increased, but because credibility was restored. Identity, in this sense, functions less like a personality trait and more like a financial instrument. It compounds slowly, transaction by transaction. Just like a credit score, it isn't built by intention or desire. It's built by recorded behavior. When those records start to align with ambition, even at a modest scale, the internal conflict begins to dissolve. You stop trying to convince yourself of who you are and instead start recognizing yourself through evidence. And that recognition changes how effort feels at a fundamental level. By now, a pattern should feel unmistakably clear. What once looked like a personal flaw starts to reveal itself as a structural issue. When energy is mismanaged, when environments quietly work against you, and when identity is built on intention rather than evidence, ambition becomes heavy, not because it's too big, but because it's unsupported. The weight you've been carrying was never proof of inadequacy. It was proof that the system around your ambition was never designed to hold it. When the focus shifts away from fixing yourself and toward engineering your energy, environment, and identity, something subtle but profound happens. Effort stops feeling like a constant uphill struggle. You don't wake up suddenly more motivated or disciplined. Instead, friction decreases. Decisions require less negotiation. Action becomes less dramatic. You don't become more disciplined. You become harder to derail. Progress no longer depends on how you feel that day. It's embedded into the structure of your life. This is the moment where the internal narrative changes. You are no longer someone who relies on motivation arriving at the right time. Motivation becomes optional, not essential. The system carries you forward even on low energy days, even when confidence wavers, even when ambition feels distant. Consistency stops being an act of force and starts becoming a byproduct of design. The nervous system relaxes because it no longer feels under constant demand. There's a quiet confidence that emerges from this shift. Not the loud kind that announces itself, but the grounded kind that comes from predictability. You trust yourself again, not because you believe harder, but because the evidence keeps showing up. One action leads to another. Momentum compounds. Identity stabilizes. The gap between who you want to be and how you live begins to close. Not through intensity, but through alignment. At that point, ambition changes its tone. It no longer feels like pressure or accusation. It feels like direction, something that guides rather than weighs. You move differently, not faster, not louder, but with less resistance. And that is the real transformation. This isn't self-help.
This is self-architecture.